There's a class action complaint in the state of California against state agencies in California who are using CRT, who are using critical race theory, and this was sent to us by one of our viewers, for which I am grateful. Let's see. I want to read. You can show my screen here, Zach. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs and then a couple more after that. So this is from October 13th, 2020, so just a few months ago. Just to set us up here, this class action seeks to eliminate discriminatory policies and customs in California state agencies that institutionalize racial preferences in connection with recruiting, hiring, and other conditions of employment, and which overtly treat people as racial categories rather than individuals. Defendants Wade Crowfoot and Charlton Bonham, collectively the defendants, who are acting secretary for the California Natural Resources Agency and director for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, respectively, have implemented policies and customs that are steeped in critical race theory, a branch of postmodern academic theory which promotes invidious race discrimination. So just a pause here for a moment. The California Department of Wildlife and the Natural Resources Agency, this is now in places where, even many of us who have been well aware of this would have thought like these agencies should have been most immune for the longest, right? Like these are actually agencies that are dealing with real things out there in the world that aren't social constructs. Later in the piece, the complaint specifies, first, Crowfoot and the speakers engage in the selection bias of isolated incidents as proof of systemic racism. So they're doing this little sleight of hand where they say, there's a thing that happened, therefore everything is racist, and systemic racism is everywhere. And second, Crowfoot and the speakers then argue that any disparate outcomes in society must be the result of white supremacy. Again, it's like, it feels like a similar point, but it's a little bit different, that any disparate outcomes, like any time you've got differential outcomes, the only possible hypothesis to explain that is white supremacy. So this is anti-logic, anti-science, anti-everything good, frankly. And then just one more section that I want to read from here. If I can find it. Okay, Zach, you can show my screen again if you like. On page 12, paragraphs 47 and 48, and I will post this in the show notes. The substance of the program follows, so this is with regard to a program that one of the defendants has used in his agency with his employees. The substance of the program follows a similar pattern. Bonham and his guests conclude, without any evidence, that the reason they do not see people out recreating in proportion to their population is entirely due to white racism, and that they would implement quotas in state agencies to assure racial equity in who chooses to use California's outdoor spaces. The conversation begins with a conjectural claim that Black people do not frequent California's outdoor spaces in proportion to their population due to white supremacy and, quote, generational trauma. Bonham discusses the idea that, quote, bad things happening in the woods, end quote, approximately 100 years ago in the Jim Crow South has led Black individuals today to believe that, quote, being around trees is unsafe.
My goodness.
My goodness.
Yes, and in fact, we have, so again, sophistry, and really that is the central concept to so much of this. So many of these claims are transparently nonsense. We have been talking about the obvious sophistry in the idea that if there is a discrepancy in the number of people relative to their representation of the population, that must inherently be the result of a bias. We've been talking about that explicitly since the DeMoore memo. Yep. Right? Where DeMoore's point was effectively, yes, it could be that, but that's not the only explanation that would generate the pattern. It's obviously true. It should take any room of 4 smart people approximately 3 minutes to establish this to a fare thee well, and yet years down the road, we are still talking about.
Are we not scientists?
Right. Are we not capable? I mean, even if you can't think of the proof yourself, right? Just simply having heard it once ought to reveal, oh yeah, there are other things that could cause the pattern. Therefore, it does not necessarily imply it, right? So, the question is, why is this stuff so sticky in these cases? Yeah. We have talked on this program extensively about the fact that differential use of, for example, bike paths or nature areas does not, and in fact cannot plausibly be the result of white supremacy, right? Nobody's keeping anybody out of the bike lane. So the point is, if you go and you measure who passes you in the bike lane and it turns out that there's a racial disparity, it may be the result of something. It may be the result of what neighborhood different races live in, and therefore how pleasant it is to bike or how safe or something like that. But it cannot be that the bike lane itself has any bias in it.
Right. And, you know, historically, I can put together an argument historically as, you know, after the Civil War, and Black people were moving north, that they would have been more likely to choose urban centers. And we, in fact, know that this did happen. And why? Because people in urban areas who had less exposure to people who looked different from them might have been more likely to bring grief to the Black people. And so people migrating out of the enslaved South might well have chosen to be in cities. And so at this point, there may be generations within Black American families of city life and far less exposure to some of this other stuff. And that doesn't mean, again, that nature is racist, or that the choices that those people were making were, you know, there was anything wrong with them, even though they may well have been making those choices in part due to an understanding that I think was probably correct, that it would be safer to move to, say, Chicago in 1880 as a Black person than to southern, you know, farmland Illinois. Probably.
Well, let's put it this way. There are dozens of impacts, right? It may be a matter of, you know, where there was likely to be work and how easy it is to commute. And there are dozens of things that may indeed be the result of past racism and past white supremacy. And
Right.
the problem is that people want to import some pattern that is differential, that may in fact have something to do with racism that may have existed 100, 200 years ago. And they want to say, therefore, it means that that racism exists today, which then results in them leveling an accusation at people.
Yeah.
You are definitely racist because you're white,
Yeah.
right? That is not a logical conclusion from the bias, no matter how much racism played into the original discrepancy that we now see manifest. And so how much better would the conversation be if we were actually talking about how these past patterns that, yes, indeed, were rooted in racism have impacts that carry through today without it functioning through the bias of people, right? Which isn't to say biased people don't exist, but it is to say you cannot do this Kendi thing where you just simply assert, oh, well, if you're not actively anti-racist by this, you know, list of criteria here, then we know what you are, right? You're part of the problem. No, that's not the way it works.
And yet he can.
Well, he can.
Right. So there is a question that I still do not have a good grasp on beyond this sort of like the left is ever more gullible. Like, why has it been so widely accepted? Why is it getting so much traction? Why is there a freaking class action lawsuit in California against the directors of these agencies whose presumably raison d'etre is about protecting the land? I mean, like this is the last place where CRT belongs, and here it is. And I'm grateful to the people who have initiated this class action lawsuit, but this is a one example in a sea of many, and of all of those examples of people actually saying, I've had enough, I'm pushing back, this is ridiculous, those reflect a tiny minority of the actual situations where no one is yet publicly pushing back because they don't know how to, they're disempowered, like whatever it is.
Well, let's try to answer that question, because I think it's hard to say what precisely the answer is, but in a general sense, it's fairly clear. And I must say, I've been frustrated by the degree to which people focus on what they call cancel culture, right? I feel like there are a lot of things that are relevant to our circumstance, free speech questions, cancel culture, etc., but the focus on them is wrong. And really, I think the answer to the question you pose is that the reason that people have fallen prey to these obvious sophistry constructions or sophist constructions is that there is a penalty, there is the equivalent of online brown shirts, and their purpose is to beat the crap out of you if you show an instinct towards rejecting these things or questioning them or deploying logic where they don't want it deployed. And so in essence, what we're seeing is not that people are endogenously so gullible. It's that in the context of a threat, if you show signs of skepticism, what happens is people stop doing that. And what it looks like is, yeah, people are accepting this obvious nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is, look, come on, how hard would it be to sell the population on the idea that there is no sexual binary? It would be almost impossible if there weren't a threat attached to it, right? Everybody knows this because it's so central to all of our lives,
Yeah.
irrespective.
Every single
straight,
human who has
trans,
ever lived knows this
right.
to be true.
Everybody knows this, right?
Yeah. So that's interesting, and I do think that the timing, the rise of so-called cancel culture, and I say so-called not because I don't believe in it, but just because, as you say, I don't think it's an expansive enough term, but we began to see this really happening at Evergreen in sort of, beginning in like 2013, 2014. That's exactly the moment that like John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about in Coddling of the American Mind as things beginning to change on college campuses. And so I do think that your answer, I've talked about a perfect storm having to do with three things, and actually Haidt and Lukianoff talk about a couple of these things as well. But what you're pointing to basically is the increasing ubiquity of social media allowed for pile-ons such that you can increase the gullibility of people in real time because they're afraid of the virtual pile-ons. And then the other pieces of the perfect storm include the widespread drugging of the children, excuse me, with anti-anxiety, antipsychotic, antidepressants, and then exogenous hormones, and all of these things, and then a parenting style that doesn't allow children to take risk and explore who they are. But the social media thing is what really what really was happening in exactly that moment. But I don't think it goes back far enough. So what that doesn't explain is why when we were in college in the late 80s, early 90s, we saw this postmodernism and we pushed back against it. And it looked, and in fact, I found, I think it was my senior thesis, I wrote into the beginning, like I'm seeing some of this nutty stuff in the literature, and it's fringe, and I don't think it'll go anywhere, but I do think it bears mentioning that this is one way that people are thinking about. My thesis was on actually how it is that in non-human primates, females establish friendships and what those friendships look like. And to some degree also how testosterone is mitigating those relationships. And there was already some of this like social constructionist stuff in that because anthropology got taken over pretty early. And I then really thought that even though we saw little glimmers of it in grad school and we laughed about it and pushed back against it in little ways, that there was no way that it would grow and that it would become so all-powerful. I did not predict as much, even though we saw it and we pushed back against particular instantiations that we ran into, I did not see the last several years coming.
Well, so I want to make this into a model because
Okay.
I agree. I didn't see it coming like this, right? We knew the danger of it, but I would never have predicted the absurdity of some of the things that are now accepted as self-evident. But so there's a question about what context you exist in. And what my claim is going to be is that when people start to espouse obviously nonsensical beliefs as if they were self-evident, there will be an analog to brown shirts, right? That the point is the two things are not separate. So to the extent that you walk into a context where people are saying crazy things, where's the enforcement mechanism? Well, in an anthropology, in a cultural anthropology department in the 90s, the enforcement mechanism is you're not welcome in this department unless you agree to these things. We have the ability not to admit you, and we have the ability to toss you out on your ear if we miss you on the first pass and then it turns out that you're a skeptic.
The numbers were so small that all it took was one social constructionist, postmodernist, post-structuralist in a department to potentially fairly quickly change the culture of the department.
Right, and the point is the department is built to be exclusive, and so excluding people is not hard.
But my point is departments were busy excluding nonsense until suddenly they were excluding everything but the nonsense.
Right.
So like that requires an explanation of what that flip is.
Well, I would argue we see in a million different contexts some sort of institution, public or private, that gets taken over by somebody who knows how to play office politics and
Right.
transitions the
To
thing.
my earlier point that because departments tend to be small in terms of number of faculty, all it really takes is one person who's got this as their mission, and they can affect change in a way that they never could in a larger. They'd be drowned out. They would be too diluted.
Right.
Diluted, in addition to being diluted in a larger population.
So in the case of the what we heard in anthropology departments in the 90s, that thing then made it into the wider world. And so the point that we should have foremost in our minds is, well, for that to have happened, we now need an enforcement mechanism that mirrors what takes place in an academic department that explains the wider context.
Yep.
And so my point would be, okay, what is that in this context? It's largely the unpersoning that can happen to you online if you show a certain kind of skepticism. And as proof of concept, the intermediate thing. Remember back when Evergreen was supposed to be an anomaly and it didn't matter. It was just college kids overreacting. Well, I was just looking at Benjamin Boyce's most recent, his 23rd episode of his Evergreen documentary.
That guy's prolific.
Yeah.
And amazing.
Prolific and amazing. And I think as a result almost entirely of his work, this is in some ways the most thoroughly documented historical event, at least, that I've encountered, right? The level of minute by minute that he's captured is incredible. But, he uses in this most recent video, he juxtaposes people saying things with video of them, same people doing things in a different context. And so one of the things he has is Jamil, who was paid by the college to help rewrite.
This is one of the activists.
This is essentially the lead activist, the one who organized the kidnapping of administrators and apparently sent people to my classroom to protest me and all of that, after invoking privately on his Facebook page the idea that it would be great to have white people face witch hunts. But anyway, this guy was hired by the college to help rewrite the student code of conduct, which he had violated later, the summer following. And Benjamin points to this video. There's a video clip of him and his clique walking around and he's flipping a baseball bat. And it's very, Clockwork Orange kind of craziness, right? But the point is, okay, people are saying crazy stuff on this campus. Where are the brown shirts? Oh, right? Caught on video. So that's the question, is every time you have people claiming to believe things that no reasonable person could possibly believe, there will be an enforcement mechanism, and you may not have put the two together, but that's what's going on.